friend. Tonight, let's embark on a spine-chilling trek of survival in the vast, isolated wilderness of Big Bend National Park. Our subject embarks on a solo camping trip, only to discover he is not alone. Strange noises, eerie tracks, and shadowy figures lead to a terrifying night of being hunted by monstrous creatures. Will he escape, or will the creatures claim another victim? So now just sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And don't forget to keep the lights on.
I should have known better. Big Bend National Park is one of the most isolated places in Texas, stretching across over 800,000 acres of rugged desert, towering canyons, and remote mountain ranges. It's the kind of place where you can go days without seeing another person. And that was exactly what I wanted. To disappear for a while, to lose myself in nature and forget about the pressures of everyday life. I'd always loved hiking and camping, and Big Bend had been on my list for years. I'd read the stories of its desolate beauty, of its untouched wilderness, but nothing could prepare me for how small and vulnerable it would make me feel. From the moment I entered the park, there was an oppressive sense of isolation that clung to everything, as if the land itself had been abandoned by time. The first few days were uneventful. I set up camp near the Chisos Mountains, spent my days hiking and my nights gazing at the stars, but it wasn't long before I noticed something off. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the eerie silence that would fall just before sundown, as though the entire park was holding its breath. It began with small things easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. My third night in the park, I woke up to the sound of rustling near my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal. Coyotes were common in these parts, but the sound was heavier, deliberate, like something large was moving just outside the thin walls of my tent. I held my breath, listening as the rustling stopped. My flashlight was within reach, but I was frozen, waiting for the sound to return. Minutes passed, maybe more, before I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent. Nothing was there, just the faint outline of the trees against the night sky. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered long after I zipped myself back inside. The next day, I found footprints near my camp, but they weren't from any animal I knew. They were large, clawed, and deep. Too deep to be from something that weighed as little as a coyote. I told myself it was probably just an old mark from a wild boar or a bear, even though my gut told me otherwise. As I hiked that day, the same uneasy feeling followed me. The park was strangely silent, devoid of the usual chirping birds and rustling leaves. Every few hours, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Just the barren landscape and the heavy, oppressive air. That night, the rustling returned, closer this time. I didn't sleep. By the fourth day, I was starting to question my decision to come out here alone. Something wasn't right. I hadn't seen another hiker or camper since I entered the park, and the usual sounds of nature were absent. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the entire park had become some kind of trap. Every step I took felt heavier, the sense of being watched growing stronger by the hour. That afternoon, while hiking near the base of Emery Peak, I saw it. Just a glimpse, no more than a flash of movement between the rocks, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but whatever I had seen was gone. Maybe it had been an animal. A deer or a mountain lion, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shape had been wrong. Too large, too fast. I pressed on, trying to shake the fear that clung to me, but the unease was growing. I decided to head back to camp early, cut my hike short. As I retraced my steps through the narrow trail, I kept my eyes on the surrounding landscape, every rustle of wind or crack of a twig sending my nerves into overdrive. That night, the creatures made their presence known. The rustling started again, but this time it wasn't just one sound, it was many. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving in sync, circling my camp. I gripped the knife I'd brought with me for protection, my hands slick with sweat as I listened to them move just outside the ring of light from my fire. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something was out there, watching, waiting. Then I saw it. A figure, hunched and misshapen, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light of the fire, staring at me with an intensity that froze the blood in my veins. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. Things like that didn't exist. But it was real. And it wasn't alone. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't stay at the camp any longer. Whatever these things were, they were hunting me. I packed my gear as fast as I could, barely pausing to extinguish the fire before setting off into the night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor, but it offered little comfort. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of some unseen predator closing in. I moved quickly, but the terrain was rough, and I had to keep my eyes on the trail to avoid stumbling over rocks or stepping into one of the many ravines that cut through the landscape. The sensation of being followed intensified with every step. I could feel their presence behind me, just out of sight, but always there. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it felt useless, barely enough to light the path ahead. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the underbrush behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, and saw them. Dark figures, moving impossibly fast, darting between the trees. There were at least 3 of them, their bodies hunched and twisted, their glowing eyes fixed on me. I bolted. My legs burned with the effort of running, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins pushed me forward. I could hear them gaining on me, the sound of their claws scraping against the rocks growing louder with each passing second. I knew I wouldn't be able to outrun them for long. Desperation set in. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they couldn't follow. Ahead of me, I spotted a narrow canyon, its entrance barely visible in the faint moonlight. Without thinking, I veered off the trail and sprinted toward it. The canyon walls were steep, towering above me, but the path was tight, too tight for anything larger than a human to pass through easily. I squeezed between the jagged rocks, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The creatures slowed as they reached the entrance, their glowing eyes peering at me from the other side. For a moment, it seemed like they might not be able to follow, but then one of them squeezed its way into the canyon, its body contorting in unnatural ways to fit through the narrow gap. I had no choice. I kept moving, scrambling over the rocks, my mind racing for a plan. The canyon was my only chance, but it was a labyrinth of dead ends and jagged cliffs. If I made one wrong turn, I knew they would catch me. The narrow passage slowed them down, but not enough. I could still hear the scraping of their claws echoing off the canyon walls, getting closer. As I ran deeper into the canyon, I found myself in a small open space, a dead end. Jagged rock faces rose on all sides, trapping me. I frantically searched for a way out, but there was none. The only way was back, toward the creatures that were now almost at the entrance. My heart raced, panic gripping me. I couldn't turn back. I had to fight or find some way to hide. The creatures emerged into the small space, their twisted forms silhouetted against the pale moonlight filtering through the narrow opening above. There were 3 of them, each more horrifying than the last. Their bodies were vaguely humanoid but grotesque, with elongated limbs and skin that looked stretched and torn, as if it didn't quite fit their bones. Their glowing eyes fixed on me, unblinking. I scrambled to find a weapon. Anything. My hand closed around a large, sharp rock. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I held it out in front of me, my hand shaking as the creatures crept closer. They moved with an unnatural grace, their movements fluid but wrong, like they didn't quite belong in this world. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I locked eyes with the nearest creature, its face a horrifying mask of jagged teeth and sunken eyes. It tilted its head, as if studying me, then it let out a low, guttural growl. The others joined in, the sound vibrating through the canyon walls. I knew this was it. They were about to strike. In a moment of desperation, I threw the rock with all my strength. It struck the nearest creature in the chest, but it didn't even flinch. They were toying with me, savoring the fear in my eyes, and I realized there was no fighting them. I had to outthink them. My only chance was to survive the night. But how? As the creatures closed in, I spotted a small ledge halfway up the canyon wall, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't much, but if I could climb to it, I might be able to hold them off for a while. Without hesitating, I turned and began scaling the rock face, my fingers gripping the sharp edges as I pulled myself up. My muscles screamed in protest, and my lungs burned from the effort, but I didn't stop. The creatures roared in frustration as they realized what I was doing. They lunged at the wall, their claws scraping against the stone as they tried to follow me. I reached the ledge just in time, pulling myself up and flattening against the wall. Below, the creatures snarled and clawed at the rock, but the ledge was too narrow for them to reach me. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe. But then, one of the creatures began climbing. Its long, spindly fingers found purchase on the jagged rock, and it moved toward me with terrifying speed. I had seconds to act. Desperation surged through me as I looked around for something, anything that could help. My flashlight had fallen to the ground below, and my knife was still in my pack, far out of reach. I was defenseless, trapped. The creature was almost upon me when I spotted a loose rock above my head. Without thinking, I reached up and yanked it free. It tumbled down the canyon wall, slamming into the creature's face with a sickening crunch. The thing let out a piercing screech and fell, crashing to the ground below. But the other two were still down there, circling, waiting for their chance. I sat on the ledge, breathing hard, my mind racing. The night stretched on, and the cold desert air bit into my skin. Below, the creatures paced restlessly, their glowing eyes never leaving me. Every time I moved, they would react, their bodies tensing as if ready to pounce. I couldn't stay here forever, but I had no way down without them attacking. Hours passed, and the fire I'd left behind at my camp was long gone. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, and even that was beginning to fade as clouds rolled in. The creatures became more restless, their growls growing louder and more aggressive. I knew they wouldn't wait much longer. Suddenly, one of them howled, a long, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the canyon. Then, they all moved, circling below me like predators closing in on their prey. With the creatures becoming more aggressive, I knew I couldn't hold out much longer. As their growls reverberated off the canyon walls, I glanced at the other side of the ledge. There was a narrow gap between the rocks leading to a steep drop, maybe 50 feet down, but I could see a path through the jagged landscape beyond. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was my only option. Taking a deep breath, I slid off the ledge, careful not to make any noise. The creatures were distracted, circling where I had been moments before. I inched toward the gap in the rocks, heart pounding in my chest. The drop was steep, but if I could make it down, I might have a chance to outrun them. I started my descent, moving as quickly as I could while trying to keep my movements silent. My boots slipped on the loose gravel, and for a moment I thought I would fall, but I managed to catch myself on a rock jutting out from the canyon wall. The creatures below suddenly stopped, their heads snapping toward me. They had seen me. Without thinking, I pushed off the wall and slid the rest of the way down, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to move. I could hear the creatures scrambling to follow, their claws scraping against the rocks as they came after me. I ran, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ankle, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The landscape around me blurred as I sprinted through the desert, dodging rocks and cacti, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, the creatures were gaining, their inhuman growls growing louder with each passing second. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a small, weathered ranger station, its roof barely visible against the dark sky. It was my only chance. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain, my legs screaming in protest as I sprinted toward the building. The creatures were right behind me now, so close I could hear their heavy breathing. I threw myself against the door, praying it wasn't locked. It wasn't. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut, collapsing against it as the creatures crashed into it from the other side. The wooden door shuddered under the impact, but it held, for now. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the small station for anything I could use to defend myself. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small oil lamp on a dusty desk. There were maps scattered across the table, an old radio, and a hunting rifle mounted on the wall. Without hesitation, I grabbed the rifle. It was heavy, the metal cold against my skin. I fumbled with the lock, managing to free it just as the door rattled again. The creatures were slamming against it now, their snarls louder, more desperate. I loaded the rifle with shaking hands, praying there were enough bullets to make a difference. The door cracked, splintering as the creatures battered against it. I took a deep breath, raising the gun as the door gave way, crashing inward. The first creature lunged at me, its eyes glowing with a terrifying hunger. I fired. The shot echoed through the small station, deafening, but the creature crumpled to the ground, its body twitching. The other two were right behind it, their snarls filling the air as they charged. I fired again and again, each shot sending a jolt through my body. One of the creatures fell, but the last one kept coming. It leapt at me, claws outstretched, its mouth open in a hideous scream. I fired one last time, the bullet slamming into its chest. The creature staggered, its glowing eyes dimming before it collapsed at my feet. Silence. I stood in the wreckage of the ranger station, my hands trembling as I lowered the rifle. My ears were ringing from the gunshots, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. The bodies of the creatures lay scattered around me, twisted and broken, their glowing eyes finally dark. For a long time, I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was still reeling, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Were these things even real? Or had the isolation of Big Bend driven me to the brink of madness? Eventually, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I forced myself to move. I stepped over the bodies, out into the cold morning air. The desert was eerily quiet, as if the creatures had taken the last remnants of sound with them when they died. I don't know how I survived that night or what those things were, but as I walked away from the ranger station, I knew one thing for certain. They weren't gone, not entirely. The eerie silence that hung over the desert wasn't natural. It was like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to stir again. I limped toward the rising sun, my body aching from the ordeal, my mind numb from exhaustion. Every shadow, every distant rustle of wind set my heart racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The creatures were dead, but it felt like something deeper, something far older than I could understand, still lingered in Big Bend. I never reported what happened that night. I doubt anyone would have believed me if I had. The park rangers who found me a day later said I looked like I'd been through hell, dehydrated, injured, and rambling about monsters in the desert. I didn't try to explain. I just wanted to get as far away from Big Bend as possible, to forget what I had seen, what had hunted me. But even now, months later, I can't forget. Sometimes, late at night, When I close my eyes, I hear them. The low, guttural growls, the scrape of claws against rock. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced they've found me again, only to realize I'm safe in my bed, far from the desolate wilderness where it all began. And yet, deep down, I know I'll never truly be safe, not as long as they're out there, lurking in the shadows of Big Bend, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander into their territory. I wasn't the first they hunted, and I won't be the last. Somewhere, in the vast, empty expanse of the park, they're waiting, and they're hungry.